Good morning. Can I welcome members, invited guests and the public, both here and watching on the webcast, to today's meeting of the Housing Committee. The main item today is a discussion with invited guests on the Decent Home Standard and private rentals. Members of the public can follow the meeting on the webcast and on Twitter using #AssemblyHousing and #DecentHomes. Please may I remind members, guests and audience to turn their phones off or to put them on silent. And can I ask if we've had any apologies?
Yes, Chair. Apologies for absence have been received from Assemblymember Devonish, for whom Assemblymember Bacon is substituting, and Assemblymember Curtin.
Thank you. Can I ask members to note the list of officers on the report and ask if they have any additional interest to declare? No? Can we agree the minutes from our previous meeting held on the 13th of June 2019?
Agreed.
Thank you. Can I ask members to note the completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings?
Noted.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the action taken under delegated authority and the response received from Heather Wheeler MP attached at Appendix 3?
Noted.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to agree the Affordable Housing Monitor report?
Agreed.
Thank you. And that brings us to today's main item, which is the Decent Home Standard in the private rented sector. So can I welcome our guests? First of all, Dan Wilson-Craw, who is the Director of Generation Rent. Meera Chindooroy, Policy and Public Affairs Manager at the National Landlords Association. David Beach, Director of Regulatory Services at the London Borough of Waltham Forest. Lydia Volans, Private Rented Sector Programme Manager at the GLA, and Scott Bryant, Private Rented Sector Programme Manager at the GLA. Good morning to you all. I'm going to kick off, first of all, with a few questions, and I'll start at this end with Dan. So the first question is, new legislation and initiatives have been introduced over recent years to protect London's renters. Has there been an improvement in standards in the private sector as a result?
It's too early to say, is the short answer. We've been doing some research ourselves, looking at a selection of councils across the country, including all of London's boroughs, asking councils how many complaints they're receiving from Cushion they've been doing, and that includes civil penalties which came in under the 2016 Housing and Planning Act. We've seen over well, in the first year that the civil penalties came in, we had 12 councils in London using these civil penalties, which are supposed to be a more streamlined way of ensuring that councils can crack down on landlords that are breaking the law. We've had a lot of councils are continuing to use full prosecution. We've had a look at the database the Mayor of London has published, which is essentially it's the rogue landlord and letting agent checker. And we're seeing roughly similar numbers of prosecutions and civil penalties, which is interesting because there was an expectation that civil penalties would be used a lot more than prosecutions. Around 9 councils aren't prosecuting any landlords.
9. Sorry, did you say 9?
And then
9 councils.
Sorry,
was that 9 councils? Sorry.
9 councils.
Yeah, thank you.
And then in terms of when councils uncover hazardous properties, one of the recent pieces of legislation that came in 2015 was the Deregulation Act, which gave councils the ability to protect tenants from a retaliatory eviction if their house was considered unsafe, but only they can give that protection by serving an improvement notice, but only 23% of cases of hazardous properties actually result in an improvement notice. As
23%.
23%, which is slightly higher than the national picture. In terms of in terms of complaints, around for the last year we did this, we had 19,864 complaints to councils in London about private rented properties, which represents 2.4% of the sector, and that's slightly lower than the national picture, which is 2.9%. There are some councils that have inspected more, that carry out more inspections than they receive complaints, which we consider them to be having a proactive strategy. So that's eight councils, 28% of London boroughs, and that's lower than the national picture, which is 37%, where councils are inspecting more than they're receiving complaints.
Okay, thank you. Just in terms of the point about civil penalty notices, I mean, this is interesting because, of course, with a civil penalty notice as well, unlike with a prosecution, the council keeps the fine, and when, of course, they take a landlord to court, they don't. But on the flip side of that, the landlord then doesn't receive a criminal record. Do you think it's important that councils strike a balance in the sense of they want to take the very worst examples to court rather than just putting a civil penalty notice on them?
Yes, there's the banning order regime which came in last year, so we haven't really seen the full impact of that, allows councils to, if they serve more than one civil penalty on a landlord, they can apply to for a banning order, or put them on the database, the national database, and these landlords already appear on the Mayor of London's public database as well. So it's a deterrent there in that respect. But yeah, certainly there needs to be a balance struck, and there needs to be, if prosecution does have the impact of driving out the worst landlords, then that's the strategy that should be pursued. Obviously, some landlords are, there's a sliding scale of poor practice.
And do you think, from when you speak to tenants, do you think tenants, they feel well informed about how to raise a complaint about the standard of their home, and importantly, even with the change in the law that is supposed to protect people who make complaints, do you think they feel confident that they can raise a complaint without fear of repercussions?
There's been some work done looking at how confident and knowledgeable tenants are around excising their rights. I think the fear of retaliatory rent hikes or evictions by landlords is deterring a lot of tenants from going to the council. I think a lot more tenants just don't know what their rights are in relation to poor practice and hazardous properties. The councils should be providing a decent level of information on their websites aimed at private renters, explaining what their roles and responsibilities are in relation to enforcing housing standards. And we're currently doing some work on how well councils are doing this. And we don't have numbers at the moment, but there's a big variation in the quality of information on council websites. Some have improved recently, some are still very minimal and very confusing if you're a renter and you need some help.
Thank you very much. If I could come to you now, Meera, with the same sort of initial question about whether the new legislation and initiatives that have been introduced over recent years have improved standards in the private rented sector.
I think that we can see from the results from the English Housing Survey that standards in the private rented sector are improving, and that have done so for the past 10 to 15 years quite significantly. That's been as a result of some of the national legislation that's come into place, such as the HHSRS standards. But the important thing is that those pieces of legislation really need to be enforced. And what we're seeing is a lack of consistency of enforcement across London, and the targeting of that enforcement particularly. So you may have certain councils which are doing a lot of inspections, but they're not inspecting the right properties. and particularly where there are landlords who are in licensed areas, that can mean that landlords feel very much that they're paying for a service that they're not actually receiving, because the criminal landlords can continue to operate without being inspected and being removed from the sector, which is to the detriment of everyone in the private rented sector. So I think that issue of enforcing and really stopping those criminals from being able to continue to operate, and particularly targeting more vulnerable tenants who don't know what their rights are and aren't in a position to enforce them, is what's key to making a change.
Okay, thank you very much. David, if we could put the same question to you. Your view on the various legislation initiatives, has it improved standards?
Okay. Well, first, I'm pleased to say that Waltham Forest is one of the 12 boroughs that Dan mentioned that have made quite extensive use of civil penalty powers. I think what I'd say is, civil penalties themselves are not a means to an end in terms of they don't necessarily directly improve property conditions per se, but I think there has to be that threat of enforcement action. I think one of the issues with legislation generally is, maybe apart from licence conditions, there isn't much legislation out there really which requires landlords to proactively manage and maintain their properties. So I think for the civil penalties to be effective, there has to be rogue landlords have to feel that there is a chance of them being brought to account and fined or prosecuted, through non-compliance. I think so we have used quite extensive use of the civil penalty powers. They are not a soft option in terms of prosecution. To pick up on an earlier point, we have reserved some of our worst breaches, and we've continued to go down the prosecution route. We have not been supported by the courts in that. We've had lower fines issued for those cases than we've imposed civil penalties. Unlike food legislation, where there are sentencing guidelines for breaches of food hygiene regulations, there are no sentencing guidelines for Housing Act prosecutions. And our general experience is the courts do not take it particularly seriously. So on the cases that we've gone down the prosecution route, we've ended up with lower sanctions, certainly financial sanctions, than we would with civil penalties. What I would say with civil penalties is that government has encouraged local authorities to use the potential sanction of up to £30,000 fine as rigorously as possible, and we've certainly done that. We've imposed some quite significant fines. Obviously, the flip side of that is that landlords have appealed those decisions, and the first tier tribunal is a low cost jurisdiction. I think it costs £100 for a landlord to put an appeal against a quite significant penalty, we've had to spend huge numbers of officer hours in defending appeals brought by landlords which really had no real prospects of success. It also tends to be a no-cost jurisdiction, so we've spent days of officer time preparing quite large bundles to go to the tribunal. The landlord was withdrawn at the last minute, and that's it. We've got our civil penalty, but we've had all our costs in preparing for that have effectively been wasted. So
will that eat up most of the civil penalty notice usually?
It depends what penalty has been imposed in the first place, but there have certainly been cases where we've had to pay out more expenses than has actually come back in the actual penalty for that individual case. So I think you rightly pointed out that one of the rationales for this whole scheme was to provide local authorities with additional resources for enforcement. That doesn't always work out really, and again, even if we go through and if it's upheld in the tribunal, we've still got collection. We've agreed payment plans with many landlords which are not being met. We've still got the job further down the line of having to get those money back through the county courts and other processes really. What I would say as well is when the guidance came out, the civil penalty guidance, we did comment on the draft proposals, and we did put a request to government that they included some stuff in the civil penalties around the tribunal having some sort of mechanism to deal with sort of vexatious, frivolous appeals which had no real prospects of success. And although that wording is in the guidance, the reality is at the moment the tribunal provide no gatekeeper role for that. So we any the tribunal at the moment accept late appeals. They accept appeals where the landlord has not specified any actual appeal grounds. So, it's a real issue to local authorities at the moment, and I appreciate that it's relatively new legislation and people are all still feeling their way with it. But I think at the moment there is a lot of bureaucracy involved with that, and certainly from a local authority point of view, and we've switched more of our stuff now to civil penalties than prosecution. But in terms of actual office resources, it's easier for us to prosecute than issue a civil penalty, I would say, on balance.
I do find it quite. Given now, I think if you employment tribunal, it costs you £1,000 or £1,500. If it's only £100 for a landlord to appeal this, it does seem a bit of a discrepancy there. But thank you, that's very interesting. And I know that Waltham Forest have been very active in things like interim and final management orders. We'll be coming to that a little bit later on in the meeting. So if I could come next to Lydia and Scott, do you want to comment on this issue of standards and whether they've risen as a result of recent legislation?
So I think, as Meera said, the English landlord survey shows some improvement in standards. I think we now actually have 13 boroughs in London using civil penalties, and from our London Borough PRS partnership, we see that the boroughs that are using civil penalties are tending to use them more than prosecutions now. But as David has said, we're seeing that civil penalties aren't necessarily the easier option that they perhaps are perceived to be, for the reasons that David has outlined. And I think generally across London we see there's a real patchwork nature of enforcement and of licensing schemes, so there's a real lack of consistency. So some boroughs are extremely proactive. They have additional and selective licensing schemes in place, and are really proactive in their enforcement. But at the other end of the scale, there are boroughs who are doing very little other than the minimum mandatory licensing scheme. So it's that real inconsistency that we still see, and as has previously been said as well, I think we see that the legislation that has come in is quite piecemeal and bolted on to existing legislation rather than giving that strategic regulatory framework approach.
Thank you, Scott. Yeah.
If I may just add to that, I think whilst the evidence that Meera referenced in the English Housing Survey does show an improvement in standards in the private rented sector, it's very difficult to demonstrate cause and effect between that and recent government legislation. And obviously, the Mayor has been putting forward a range of initiatives in London to help improve standards, and so kind of establishing what the impact of those versus the impact of legislation has been is quite difficult. And I think I just reinforce the kind of resourcing issue for local authorities. I mean, councils are the body that has the kind of responsibility for overseeing standards in private renting in London, but I think it's fair to say, and kind of reflecting what David said, just don't have the resources to be able to do that as effectively as they would like, and I think that has led to the patchwork that we've seen across London.
Thank you. And we'll be coming on to some of the mayoral initiatives later in the meeting. Assemblymember Berry, you had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify something that Meera said from the National Landlords Association. You said you thought that inspections weren't targeted at the right properties, and I think you said that they're targeted on areas that have additional licensing, and therefore you implied that landlords who weren't in those areas didn't face inspections. Is that what you were saying?
No, I was saying that in the areas where there are licensing schemes, the approach to the targeting of inspections varies. So in some areas you might see that there are a high number of inspections, and so a large proportion are inspected, but very few hazards found or prosecutions made, compared to other areas where they're much more targeted in what their approach is in inspection, and then you see that there's a much higher proportion of criminal landlords prosecuted. So, for example, in Newham, their approach is to target those who haven't registered, who haven't been licensed. So you know that those landlords who aren't complying with that basic requirement to license their property are likely to have poor conditions in the property. So I think that the idea that licensing in itself is an answer isn't correct. There has to be that enforcement alongside that, and the enforcement should be targeted to those landlords who are acting in contravention of the law.
Do you find that similar thing, Dan, from Generation Rent? When you've been looking at how proactive councils are you looking at also whether they're targeting their inspections or being less targeted about it?
So one of the things that's interesting, in looking at how councils were performing with their inspection and enforcement, we had a similar observation where there were a lot of proactive councils who tended to have licensing schemes, not necessarily all of them, who were doing lots of inspections but not necessarily responding to hazards with improvement notices, which obviously is what we're relying on to really hold landlords to account. And then you would find that there were councils with fewer inspections that were being a bit more a bit stricter when they did uncover hazards. So that's certainly a difference in approach, and there's clearly a need to, when you do have a licensing scheme, target the unlicensed landlords, but then also have something in place to make sure that the landlords who are getting licenses are meeting the terms of their license.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. So I'll move on to our next question. I'll start with Dan again. So moving on to the question of the Decent Home Standard. It's used to measure the quality of homes for all tenures, but only social landlords are required to follow it. Should it apply to all landlords?
Yes. I mean, every renter, everyone should have a basic expectation of a decent home, which is, at the moment we've got the housing health and safety rating system, which is what councils use currently to ensure that tenants aren't living in unsafe homes. But we do need to have something a bit better than that baseline, which is an expectation that you're able to afford your housing, your heating bills, just generally not living in a home with disrepair issues, even if it's not necessarily life-threatening, but an expectation that your landlord will respond to requests to make repairs, and that's all part of the Decent Home Standard. That's a basic part of the housing transaction. You pay your rent. You should expect these minimum standards from your landlord.
And the government quite recently introduced minimum energy efficiency standards. I think that's what they're MEES. It's probably again too early to say if it's had an impact, but do you have any sort of evidence about whether these standards have started to improve homes in terms of things like insulation and things like that?
We haven't looked at this yet. One of the things that is sort of already covered in the rating system, the HHSRS, is there's a hazard around excess cold, and so that's something that the councils currently have in their as a way of enforcing issues around energy efficiency, and so I mean that's something that we're interested in, and there are we hear from some people on the front line that focusing on targeting excess cold under the current system is, might have more effect on encouraging landlords to make the improvements they need to make than the minimum energy efficiency standards. But obviously, again, it's a bit early to say, and this isn't something we've looked at properly.
Thank you. Okay, Meera, same question to you. 1 in 4 private rented sector properties don't meet the decent home standard, compared to 1 in 7 in the social rented sector. Do you think that landlords should have to comply with a decent home standard?
No, I don't. I think it's a very different tenure, and it's a very different market. The private rented market has that flexibility for tenants to choose to leave a property if they wish to. The market needs to be able to work. There should, of course, be minimum standards that landlords have to meet to ensure the home is fit for human habitation, and that is the case using HHSRS, as Dan mentioned, and the existing fitness for human, the new legislation that came in this year to allow tenants to enforce fitness for human habitation directly with their landlord if they don't want to go through the local
Sorry,
authority.
Senator Cooper, I can't hear what's being said. You can come in. You can come in.
No, I was
I'm going
just
to be
expressing some shock.
I know. I'm going to be.
Someone
Thank you. You can come in a moment if you wish. Sorry. Please continue.
I think the reality is that the private rented sector is a mix of a wide range of different types of landlords, and a lot of landlords have 1 or 2 properties that they're renting out, compared to social landlords, which are a much bigger kind of corporate body, and it's reasonable that social landlords should be meeting the requirements of them as a corporate body. That isn't to say that landlords don't need, as I said, don't need to meet those minimum standards, and that should be enforced. But I think the decent home standard goes beyond what the requirements should be for the private sector.
I just take up some of the things that you said. I mean, you said that the sectors are very different because in the private rented sector people can move around. A lot of people, particularly at the lower end, have no choice. The property that they find might well be the only property in the area that they can afford, and therefore they may be forced to accept something that is pretty substandard. So, would you agree that actually a lot of tenants in the private sector don't have choice?
I think that's a different issue, which is a much wider structural issue about the lack of social housing and the lack of accessibility of social housing for those tenants who need it, which means that more tenants who wouldn't have traditionally been in the private rented sector are renting in the private rented sector. So that really needs to be addressed by wider government policies to support people with ensuring that they have appropriate levels of income and are able to access the properties that they need to.
Do you think, regardless of whether or not someone is living in the social rented sector and the private rented sector, they should be able to expect to live in a decent quality home? And if the private rented sector, and I think you're right to point this out, the private rented sector is now housing more people that would traditionally have been housed in the social rented sector, but given that is a fact, don't you think that the private sector should meet the same standards as the social rented sector for the sake of those people who can't be housed in the social rented sector because there simply aren't enough homes at the moment?
I think that the standards in terms of repair and the quality of the housing are covered by HHSRS. So I don't see what the benefit would be of bringing private rented housing under the decent homes in terms of improving the repair of the properties, because the issue is really the enforcement of HHSRS and making sure that housing in the private rented sector is meeting the standards that currently exist.
But of course, as Dan pointed out, the decent home standard is a lot broader than just your sort of basic health and safety. And particularly the social rented sector, you had kitchens replaced, bathrooms replaced, windows replaced and things like that. So I mean, I think it is more broad. But I'll bring in Assembly Member Cooper, who I know is championing a bit to come in on this issue.
I'd like to make a declaration to say that I am a private rented landlord and I managed to rent out a property that meets the decent home standard. So I fundamentally do not, and I don't have a huge number of properties. I'm not Clarion Housing Group. Like many people, as you just mentioned, just, one or two properties. I just rent out one property and it meets a decent level of EPC rating. The windows are not falling out, it's weatherproof and weather tight. I mean, the various aspects of the decent home standard include the HHSRS. Are you really suggesting that the other aspects in terms of heating and weatherproof are not suitable for the private rented sector? Why is that?
Of course, landlords should be providing good homes, and the vast majority of landlords do. I think that the issue is the regulation of that process, and I think introducing the decent home standard into the private rented sector won't resolve that issue, because the issue is the enforcement of the standards, and if the enforcement isn't there, what's the point of introducing further regulation? The regulations that exist, the regulations for HHSRS, for EPC, minimum energy efficiency standards, those provide some of those protections, and they're just not being enforced. So adding further regulation onto this situation isn't the answer.
But suggesting that you're unable to rent out a property if it's cold and therefore potentially damp and full of condensation and mould, you have to provide a copy of your EPC before you're able to rent out your property. Surely at that point, if your EPC fails to meet, an E is not particularly high, I don't think we want to see properties that are FG or even H rented out anymore. You've just said most landlords do meet these levels, so why can't we just say, I'm terribly sorry, you need to go away and bring your property up to EPC E at an absolute minimum, and failing that you cannot rent it out.
But they do have that requirement, and that requirement from next year will be for all properties in the private rented sector. So
exactly. So that means there's another part of the decent home standard that is being applied to the private rented sector. So why can't we apply the same principle in terms of a reasonable state of repair? Why should anybody have to put up with, kitchens and bathrooms that are falling to pieces?
But they shouldn't have to put up with that anyway under HHSRS.
In that case, if it's exactly the same as HSSRS, then why not just say, yes, okay, we'll accept the decent homes standard? What is it that is additional about the decent home standard that you don't think the private rented sector should be required to meet in terms of standards?
It's not exactly the same as HHSRS, as the decent home standard, because the decent home standard has time limits on, for example, the kitchen and bathroom. That doesn't mean that those kitchens and bathrooms aren't suitable. In the social sector, those would have to be ripped out and replaced, even if they are suitable. So I think it's just adding an extra layer of regulation which doesn't actually address the issue of improving the repair of properties. And as I said, the nature of landlords in the private rented sector is very different to the nature of social landlords, and that's going to be a significant outlay for those landlords who only have a small number of properties and who perhaps it isn't their full-time occupation, and that's going to lead to those landlords passing that on to their tenants in the form of higher rents. So I think
Possibly not. Possibly they might suffer less voids if they're renting out a property that's in a decent state. Having just self-disclosed that I've had almost, people falling over themselves to re-rent my property. I think, in the number of years that I've been renting it out, which is probably now about 15, it's probably been void for about 5 weeks.
Well,
and that's
then
because
that's
it's
the
in
market working.
But it's also people wanting to move into it because it's in a good state of repair. Their bills are low because it's insulated and in good condition. You know, it doesn't have a bathroom. And actually, you know, what you're saying about having to rip out a bathroom because it's old, there were some local authorities who did do that. Others took they looked at the Decent Home Standards and said, well, we don't have to remove the entire bathroom. We just have to make sure it's in good repair, because there was actually a slight grey area there. So I think having something in good repair, we would all want to see that. I mean, I think, you know, Assembly Member Copley, the Chair, has just expressed it very well. What is it about the Decent Home Standard that you would not want to see applied? Surely, it's pretty basic as well.
I think I come back to my... you've just demonstrated that the market works. You offer a good quality of home, and you have a home that tenants want to rent. So that should be encouraging landlords to improve the qualities of their homes, because it's good business sense. But adding further regulation on top of regulations that already aren't enforced, I don't think is the answer.
Let me bring in Assembly Member Boff, who has a question.
Do you think private rental landlords would be willing to improve their standards to decent homes standard if they received the massive grants that the Decent Homes programme did receive to local authorities? And do you also think that it would be acceptable for the government to pay vast amounts of public money out to private landlords in order to improve their properties?
I think the accessibility of money to improve properties would certainly make landlords much more keen to meet those standards. Whether the government would find that acceptable or not, it's not for me to say, but certainly landlords, you know, if there's grant funding available to improve the quality of properties, then why would landlords not take that opportunity?
Perhaps it's something we can suggest to Jeremy Corbyn for his manifesto, that he can put public money into private rented accommodation so that they can improve their stock. Looking forward to that one.
As much as I can see where Andrew's question was coming from, actually, it does sort of touch on a point that I was going to ask, which is, okay, rather than say stick some carrot, not talking about grants, but let's say there was some sort of, I think there have in the past been schemes for this on energy efficiency. I'm looking at Assemblymember Cooper. But if there was, say, low-cost loan schemes or things like that, would landlords welcome that as a way to improve the quality of their properties?
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you, Meera. We'll move on now to David. So again, the question of whether or not you think the Decent Home Standard should apply in the private rented sector.
There's not a straightforward yes or no for me on this one, really. I think, you know, I find I've got some common ground with my colleague from the NLA on this one. I think, I don't know whether people know where the Decent Home Standard originated from, but I think it obviously came in the early 2000s. It was measured through the English House Condition Survey and then the English Housing Survey. One of my previous lives, I was actually involved on the English Housing Survey. My understanding was that one of the ways that the Decent Home Standards was defined was on things which could be measured through the English Housing Survey, data which was already collected through that survey, such as the age of amenities and such as the state of repair and so on. So I think if I had a blank piece of paper and I was starting out now in terms of, you know, what standards private rented accommodations should meet, I wouldn't necessarily look at the Decent Home Standards as being the standard that properties should aspire to, really. I mean, obviously, the government made a decision in the early 2000s to move away from the old fitness regime that was there at the time. There was provision at that time in terms of properties which were not unfit, but were in substantial disrepair with the risk of falling into unfitness, and all of that was obviously swept away. And you know, I just again remind people really that the rating system we've got, you know, our main tool for intervening in dealing with conditions in private rental sector is not a standard. It is a goal-based, risk-based assessment system. It is not standard. And I think you know, in terms of standards, you know, I think landlords and local authorities, I think, would very much welcome a clear standard that properties had to meet, and we haven't got that at the moment. In terms of, so we haven't really got a mechanism, I would say, to enforce the decent home standard in the private rented sector. So, for example, a reasonable state of repair per se, we've not got a means to enforce that. If you've got a roof which is in poor condition and it's leaking, then that might give rise to a significant damp hazard, but you deal with it under Part 1. But if you've got a property, for example, which has got some poor brickwork pointing or some rotten windows, unless you can link that to a hazard, there isn't a clear mechanism to enforce that. And critics of the old fitness standard and the old approach to that, so is that really a problem? If a house looks pretty shoddy, it might have poor pointing, it might have rotten windows, but if there's no dampness coming in, is there actually a risk to the occupier? That's what the whole basis of the rating system is to try and focus local authorities' efforts on enforcing against things which actually had a direct impact on the tenants. I don't necessarily agree with that, because I think it's important that the stock is well maintained. I don't think we have a real clear mechanism to deal with things like area improvement, area clearance and so on through the rating system. But so in terms of decent homes, I don't think there's a clear mechanism to enforce it under existing legislation. If I had a blank piece of paper, that wouldn't necessarily be the standard I would devise. I think the standard we have was partly a reflection of what information was collected through the English House Condition Survey, and I think members will probably remember that the English House Condition Survey went from a 5-year big bang approach to a continuous survey in 2001, and that was very much to monitor decent homes compliance. The other thing you mentioned was about the MEES. I think the MEES was a massively wasted opportunity, really. I think concentrating on properties which are F and G, we could be improving properties still to an E, and those properties could still have a significant hazard, really. And I think there's too many exemptions and get-outs for, to me landlords ought to having to comply with those minimum energy requirements. There shouldn't really be exemptions for them.
Well, speaking of someone who rents a band F flat, if you forget to put the heating on in the morning, in winter it's like waking up outside. It's absolutely grim. Yeah. So anything to improve energy standards in the private rented sector.
Council tax is cheap.
Doesn't feel like it. Anyway, my energy bills are not, unfortunately. To Scott and Lydia, I don't know what the GLA has a position on whether or not do you think the decent home standard should apply in the PRS?
So I think the Mayor would support a consistent standard across 10 years, a consistent standard for property conditions. I think the kind of important distinction to make here is that actually we know through the English Housing Survey that actually decent home standards is and can be used as a basis for assessing equality in the private rented sector, and it is on an annual basis. The number of properties that meet decent home standards in the private rented sector is identified. I think the challenge is obviously about ensuring that there are the resources there to be able to improve the standards and the conditions in the private rented sector. So the key distinction between the social housing sector and the private rented sector is that the social housing sector had quite a lot of investment pumped in to bring those standards up to decent home standard within a kind of set time scale. I think the other thing that I would add is that we kind of picking up on David's point is that the Mayor has, in his response to the Government Social Housing Green Paper, recognised that actually a decent home standard as currently stands could be reviewed and would benefit from a review, particularly to reflect fire safety and improvements in fire safety. And so I think it's probably a bit more nuanced than the Mayor supporting the decent home standard as currently is. It's more about kind of looking at what the standard should be and making sure that that is fit for purpose for the market that we're currently operating in.
Thank you. I think Assembly Member Boff wanted to come in.
Can I just ask Mr. Bryant, if the Mayor is committed to an equal standard, is he therefore going to come up with some cash in order to be able to that he can send to the private sector so that they can get up to standard? As you alluded to, decent home standard required an awful lot of public money.
It's certainly expensive. Yes, I mean, the mayor is, yeah, I'm speaking obviously as an individual rather than from the mayor's office. We are certainly not as a team looking at kind of costing up what the total cost of improving the properties in the private rented sector are to a decent home standards, how much that cost would be.
But the mayor does think resources should go into...
Yes, absolutely.
So public resources should go into privately rented
Well,
sector.
so I think there's definitely a question about how that money would be invested. The mayor has not publicly said where the funding should come from for doing this.
Well, it will come from me. And
I think this is probably more a question for James Murray when we have him in next.
I'm just interesting because that is a revelation that the mayor does support.
Well, maybe we could get some more information on that. Maybe we could have someone, maybe James himself, could write to us about what the mayor is thinking on that front.
Yes, because it sounds expensive to me.
Yeah, and obviously the concern would be that the cost for improving standards falls to a tenant or falls to tenants in the private rented sector.
Which tenants, sorry?
Falls to tenants in the private rented sector, and we know obviously that a good proportion of those tenants are vulnerable and are low-income households, and so I think there's a kind of I think kind of achieving a decent homes standard in the private rented sector is something that requires quite a lot of thought and quite a lot of policy development.
Any more, Andrew? No. Member Bacon. Sorry, you wanted to.
Thank you very much, Chairman. I'm a bit of a layman on housing. I'm a guest here today. I don't normally sit in this committee, and I haven't rented housing since I was at university, so I'm not as exposed to it as perhaps the Chairman is. And I've sort of been wrestling with some of the answers I've been hearing about the decent home standard. Obviously, Assembly Member Boff is coming at this from the level of the extra expense that we put onto private landlords, and that could have a knock-on impact on supply, and I understand that completely. I'm trying to get to the bottom in my head, though, of why the decent home standard can't or shouldn't apply to the private rented sector. And I think I'm coming back to what Meera and David were saying earlier on. Is it because the standard is inappropriate, or is it because local authorities simply don't have the capacity to enforce it?
I think from my viewpoint, I think it's about clearly some elements, free from significant hazards and having decent energy efficiency and so on, not a problem. All homes should have that. I suppose it's the specific elements of decent homes, such as the reasonable repair and the modern facilities, whether a dwelling that did have some disrepair and didn't have modern facilities per se would be unsuitable to be let out, whether that is a priority for enforcement and for standards.
I'm not sure that answered my question. I'm trying to sort of understand why. I understand if the state is providing housing, then the state can set whatever bar it wants to set, and that is appropriate because you can't have the state putting people into inadequate housing. But if the private sector is providing housing, it's a bit of a surprise to me that there is no comparable measure, or at least that's what I'm picking up from this exchange this morning. And I'm just trying to understand why. The decent home standard, we've heard from Assemblymember Cooper, is not particularly stretching the standard. And it looks like from the housing survey that 80% of private renters are happy with their accommodation. So we're talking about a relatively small part of the market. And your point earlier on, I think it was your point, Meera, about the market is clearly working in Assemblymember Cooper's case because she's providing an adequate home at the right level and her tenants want to stay in there, which is why she's only had 5 weeks of voice. Notwithstanding the extra layer of cost that would be imposed on private renters, which could have an impact on supply, why is the decent home standard not suitable to be applied to private accommodation?
I think it's suitable to apply, and I think it's a measure that could be it's a measure where you could compare performance in the private rented sector with other sectors. I suppose my point again is that there isn't necessarily at the moment a clear enforcement mechanism to enforce all of the elements in decent homes in the private rented sector as there would be in the social sector. So
that would come back to the question of lack of capacity in local government. Is that fair?
No, lack of powers, lack of actual...
Lack of powers?
Lack of powers.
So it would need a change in the law then for local authorities to be able to enforce?
Really, you'd be going back to the legislation which the government jettisoned in the early 2000s, which were, you know, the legislation which talked about properties being in disrepair but not unfit, but, you know, the whole legislative regime which stopped properties falling in, you know, sliding into unfitness. That's the kind of legislation you'd be going back to on that. So,
Right, okay. I think you've more or less answered my question. Meera, did you want to add anything to that?
I think I'd slightly differ in, I think that that there's certainly a level of quality that needs to be a minimum level of quality which tenants can expect from their properties. I don't know whether the decent home standard is appropriate for the private rented sector because of some of those issues about the sort of modernisation of facilities which may not actually reflect the repair.
So what you're saying is the decent homes standard is a movable feast then, so as time goes on, landlords will be required to constantly be updating their properties, which is a considerable drain and cost, and that's likely to make them want to just get shot of it. And is that your argument?
Yeah,
Okay.
I think it's not, as it stands, it's not appropriate for the private renter sector. But
Okay.
that's not to say that there shouldn't be standards within the private renter sector. I'm certainly not saying
It's just
that
not
at
this
all.
one.
Just not this one.
Is it not the case? I mean, I've known lots of tenants no tenant would reject their electrics being fixed or their homes being safe. But you actually had quite a few tenants when Decent Homes was being rolled out saying, actually, I want my old kitchen. I don't want this new kitchen. It wasn't about health and safety. It was about what is perceived as a modern implementation. And I think, would you say that's one of the arguments for the Decent Home Standard not applying to the private rented sector?
People did repairs instead.
Yeah, they wanted their own.
I think there was some inflexibility from the tenant's perspective, certainly in terms of the original Decent Home Standard. Okay, we'd better move on now, though, and it is actually Assembly Member Box for the next question.
Right.
So,
actually, a lot of this has already been answered by, but let's go for it anyway, because my question is about whether or not local authorities have the powers or are local authorities equipped to tackle poor housing standards in the private rented sector? You've touched on things like civil penalties and stuff like that. Are there any other areas where you feel, are there other areas where perhaps you aren't equipped or there needs to be a change for you to be able to carry out your role?
me?
Yes. Local authority, yes, indeed.
Okay. I think it's already been touched upon. There are quite a wide range of powers available now, but they have been added on quite a piecemeal basis. I don't think there's been any real strategic overview, I would say, on legislation that we have available to us. Again, with the possible exception of the new fitness, the Homes Act, and licence conditions, there's not really legislation, I don't think, which really encourage landlords to proactively manage their property. A lot of the enforcement powers are kind of reactive. Generally, I think a lot of legislation is quite complex, and there are quite a lot of loopholes which landlords can exploit. I'm just giving an example. We've got a huge prosecution at the moment, which has been ongoing now for 2.5 years. We're still not in court yet because the landlord has been a succession of judicial reviews against different decisions. So, for example, we invited the landlord in for an interview under caution in relation to alleged offences, and he's applied for a judicial review against our decision to invite him in for a post-interview. So, I think landlords certainly with money and resources can frustrate the enforcement process. Part 1 powers, the key tool that we have to look at conditions in the private rented sector is complex and cumbersome. Again, I think the government are looking at a review of that at the moment. And again, the profession is quite divided about that, but whether it's a good thing or not. But personally, I think it's overly complex, and I don't think it facilitates. I'd be interested to see what my colleague from the NLA says, but I don't think it's an easy piece of legislation for a landlord to look at that and think, well, this is what I need to do to my property to comply with that particular legislation. There's issues around things like powers of entry, so we have to give notice of entry we have to give warnings of landlords for certain entry powers, which often defeats the actual purpose of the inspection. So certainly our Part 1 powers in terms of things like prohibition orders, licensing provisions. There are certain again, it's a complicated area of legislation with not clear definitions in certain case. We make a lot of use of interim management orders, but for example, if we issue an interim management order in which we take over the management of that particular property, a landlord can carry on managing the property and collecting the rent, and there's no offence created in the legislation which actually stops the landlord from doing that.
On those management orders, interim management orders, is that a cost-effective thing for the local authority to put into place?
I think it is. I think we're in a bit of a unique position. I mean, the big drawback with the interim management orders is obviously taking over the responsibility for managing the properties, and I think that's probably why a lot of local authorities balk at that the use of those particular powers. Although, to be honest, it's not really a power; it's actually an obligation in certain situations. You know, the law says the local authority shall make an interim management order in certain circumstances. You know, we have got our own in-house social lettings team. And that's meant that we haven't got the headache then of managing the properties, because we've got a in-house team who are used to managing tenancies, collecting rent, managing rent accounts and that kind of thing really. But the legislation is not without its faults. But again, there is provision in there that we will use collective rents to meet our charges. And there's provisional legislation which says that if the rent doesn't cover all of our expenditure on a property, we've got powers to get that money back through the court. So there's certainly powers that we would look at using as much as possible.
Is the management of licensing schemes an overhead for local authorities, or is it very straightforward?
It is, but again, obviously local authority will decide how it sets its licence fees. Like, a local authority can bring a licensing scheme and decide not to charge a licence fee at all. But most local authorities obviously set their licence fee to cover all of their costs of administering and enforcing the costs of running that licensing scheme. And that's certainly what we do in Waltham Forest. We try to set our fees at a cost recovery basis.
And so what you're saying is that local authorities can put licensing schemes in on the cheap and perhaps not do the enforcement that was referred to earlier from the
I don't think they can do that, because I think if you bring a licensing scheme in, you have to be clear about, you have to make the justification for why licensing is needed, and you have to be clear about what your scheme objectives are. And obviously if you're going to have an objective of improving X hundred or X thousand properties, inspecting X hundred or X thousand properties, you have to have the resources to do that. I suppose I'm trying to make the point that a local authority could choose to, if they wanted to, I don't know if they've actually gone down that route, but they could fund it through other sources of income available to them rather than through charging a licence fee. But obviously most local authorities will charge a licence fee for that.
Are local authorities making use of the full range of powers that they have available to them?
I'd like to think that we are. I think having large-scale licensing, gives us the full range of powers available, including interim management orders, including civil penalties in terms of the full range of licensing contraventions, both in terms of non-licensing and also failure to comply with licence conditions. I think, as has been touched on before, I think there have obviously been resourcing issues with local authorities. I think a lot of local authorities' enforcement teams over the years have reduced significantly in number and maybe are below critical mass in terms of either the number or expertise, to carry out the full range of enforcement functions.
So, are there perhaps others on the panel might be able to give us their perspective on the powers the local authorities have and if they're being effectively used? Mr. Wilson-Craw.
Sorry, can you repeat?
Well, if the powers that the local authorities have are being effectively used at the moment, And in addition, what powers should they have?
So there's a couple of points I'd make just on interim management orders. One of the bits of feedback we've had from councils is that with the council taking over property that's considered unfit, there's an obligation to improve it, and ultimately that there's a fear that some landlords might see that as a way of having their properties improved without them having to do anything, and so there's a feeling that we should be maybe these powers aren't being used because of that fear that landlords would take advantage of it, and council should have stronger powers to take over properties of serial offenders. Excuse me. One of the other things that we've heard from councils that we've spoken to is, particularly in London, there's with the resourcing issue, councils, they might train up a cohort of environmental health officers, invest money in that, but then they see a higher salary somewhere else, and just maybe a neighbouring borough or across the city, and so there's a bit of a essentially new resources will be competing for a sort of relatively fixed pool of expertise, and so there needs to be some. I might be straying off the topic here, but it needs to be some strategic attempts to improve the expertise available to local authorities. And just, finally on, two more things. Councils now tenants have the right to claim back rent through rent repayment orders relating to a few offences under the 2016 Housing and Planning Act, but our research has found that very few councils are actually helping tenants recover rent in these cases. There's a few councils. Let me just double check if we've got those. It was just a handful that in the last financial year that had done any support of recovering rent through rent repayment orders, even though there had been a lot of prosecutions. So that's something that it's clear there's power that exists that doesn't seem to be being used. And then just finally, one of the things we've heard from tenants is that if they have a problem that their landlord's refusing to fix, and they're feeling quite intimidated by the landlord, okay, well, we need to tell the landlord about this, and the tenant, because they know what the landlord's like, they might come over, harass them. They'll just decide, no, I don't want an inspection. And this is one of the benefits from selective licensing schemes, that councils are actually able to step in and carry out inspections without running the risk of sort of inflaming tensions between the landlord and the tenant.
Chindooroy, what about your view on the use of the powers that local authorities have?
I can't hear you.
Oh, thank you. Sorry, that's not usual.
What's gone wrong?
I beg your pardon.
I think that there are a range of powers which are available to local authorities, but as has previously been discussed, the use of those varies significantly, and particularly with regard to civil penalty notices. Not, as has been mentioned previously, not all councils have brought in the policy to use those powers yet. The issue around the availability of environmental health officers is also one that we hear from local authorities, and that there's just a very high churn of EHOs. which means that it can be hard to have the resource available to do the enforcement that's necessary. When it comes to licensing, I think that the issue of a license covering the cost is obviously one that's quite contentious in the landlord community, because many landlords see the cost of the license, but they don't see the service that applies. And although there may be justifications which are used in the consultation phase, there's no requirement for local authorities to do any reporting or assessment of the impact of that licensing scheme. And it was something we were very disappointed to see wasn't included in the selective licensing review that the UK government recently published, in terms of requiring a reporting from local authorities to show the impact of the licensing schemes that have been introduced.
So you think there should be more transparency in the licensing thing? I mean, I know of an example, for instance, the selective licensing regime in Barking and Dagenham. You cannot see who's on the register until they've had a visit from the local authority, which means that some properties that are not. You don't know whether or not they've got a selective license because they are hidden from the public. Curiously enough, one of those properties that is owned by a Labour councillor in Barking and Dagenham. So it's quite odd that they've been so tardy in revealing that selective licensing measure to the public. But anyway, that's as an aside. Thank you for that.
I think before I bring in Assembly Member Gavron, I just had to go back to David interim management orders, because I know Waltham Forest has been leading some charge on this in London. You know, most boroughs, they may have done one, but I think most have done none. I mean, you mentioned that you have a sort of social lettings agency which helps. Is that the sort of crucial thing? What's missing in other boroughs? Is it something that is it something they put in the too difficult box? Does it require a lot of political sort of push? If you were going to try and export this to other boroughs, what would you say?
Ultimately, I think that the challenge is the management challenge. I think if you the effect or impact of issuing an interim management order is you take over that immediate responsibility in terms of the management of the property. So we're fortunate in having our own in-house social lettings agency. If you didn't have that in-house capability to manage the property, the alternative, I imagine, would you'd have to look to the private sector to find a responsible local letting or managing agent, I would think, to manage the property on your behalf. And obviously then there's possible potential conflicts of enforcement in terms of working with a local agent. I'm sure a local authority will pick out one with a very good track record and so on, but if there were future enforcement issues that came up with that particular agent, there would be a bit of a conflict in terms of that relationship, really.
Okay, so and then if I could just pass on quickly to the GLA team, is this something that the City Hall could help boroughs with? I don't know whether it's something that it could be done in terms of resources, but in terms of trying to assist boroughs with this issue of management. Is it something the mayor's looking at?
It is an issue that we've discussed at our PRS partnership meeting with the boroughs, and I think, David, you are going to be, in fact, presenting to them in a couple of weeks' time to talk about how the model works in Waltham Forest and how other boroughs might be able to replicate that.
Great, thank you. Member Gavron.
Yes.
And then you can move into your question area as well.
Yes, it was really going back to enforcement, Tom. I'm glad you asked the question about social letting agencies at a local level. Just on the enforcement, this is really drawing on my experience of having been a councillor and a chair of planning years and years ago, chair of housing as well as planning, years and years ago, and also on an idea I put up to national government and actually to the previous mayor. All of you have been talking about enforcement and saying, and I've heard you say it's patchy, it's under-resourced, and even if it is well-resourced, then they're so highly skilled and so sought after, enforcement officers are then poached And from my experience, enforcement officers are very highly trained, very skilled, and very expensive. And we never ever had enough of them, and these are in much better days in the past. And I know we don't have enough now across London. And it strikes me, from having looked into a lot of the issues you're talking about, that we don't need enforcement officers in every case to have that level of skill and training. And we could have a different level, and going beyond apprentices, but not even trainees, but another level. And there's certain identifications, certain tasks that could certainly be carried out by them. And I just wonder whether, let's start with David, would that work, do you think?
I think it's a very valid point. I think we're at the position now with our cabinet has recently agreed to bring in an additional HMO licensing scheme borough-wide from 1st of April next year. We have our submission with the MHCLG at the moment for another further large-scale selective licensing scheme. And we're already, we've got quite challenging targets of objectives for the new schemes, and I think we're thinking very carefully about what the makeup is, what kind of staff we need to deliver those objectives. And you're completely right. I don't think it is just about highly qualified, experienced EHOs. Obviously, the requirements in terms of mandatory HMOs changed from the 1st of October 2018. There's a lot more properties now need a mandatory HMO licence in place. We have been cushioned somewhat in Waltham Forest from that because under the transitional arrangements that came in, landlords who already had a selective licence don't need to apply for a mandatory HMO licence until their existing licence expires. But come the 1st of April 2020, we estimate we're probably got between 5,000 and 6,000 HMOs in Waltham Forest which will need a licence. Now the issue then is, what kind of staff do you go to get to do the inspection? And I think you could clearly have a lower trained or lower level enforcement officer. So we are committed to inspecting every HMO before a licence is granted. We think we could have a lower trained officer to assess the initial state of the property to draw.
Can I just interrupt? Are you actually going to do this?
Yes.
You are.
Yeah.
So you can be a model for this.
We're happy to happy to take the plunge on that. Yeah.
Yes.
And again, so for example, when all the licences are granted, and a number of them will be granted subject to complying with lists of works and so on. One thing we've already talked about is having an initial compliance officer goes and does all of the they go and do a number of checks per day, and they'll identify properties where the landlord has done all the works, properties where the landlord has done the majority of works, and then maybe hopefully identify a minority of cases where the landlord hasn't started works, hasn't complied. They can then be referred to the specialist enforcement officers to do targeted inspections and follow-up. So, I mean, you're completely right about resources, but I think we have to, local authorities have to look at what's available, and they have to look at the inspection tasks, enforcement tasks, and cut their cloth accordingly, really.
Is this something the Mayor could take up, Scott, Lydia?
This is an issue that we're certainly aware of, and it's something that we have discussed at the Private Rented Sector Partnership.
But I think, just to come back to some of the points David was making, I think it's completely true that there just aren't enough staff coming through the environmental health route. But I think there's a question as to exactly what level staff you do need. And while it's true that you need those staff to go out and do inspections, there is also a shortage of staff who can actually prepare those cases for prosecution. And I think that, so you do still need more of those higher level expertise staff.
I'm not saying that you don't. I'm just saying that there are a lot of tasks that could...
Yes, I think so.
And how you achieve it's another matter.
Yeah, but I just think it's worth making the point that there is a real shortage of those higher level staff, and there are boroughs that are really struggling to recruit staff to do those roles. So it's not just a question, I think, of filling up those lower level roles.
Chair, I won't go on labouring this point, but I just thought it was worth raising because I think we have such a resourcing issue in London, and it's such an important issue.
I concur.
You concur?
Yes.
Okay.
I mean, we concur that is absolutely one of the key issues that we see coming through the PRS partnership. Absolutely.
Yeah.
One thing we look at.
Oh, sorry, did you want to come in, David?
Just, one thing we look at, for example, at the moment is we've got new licence conditions for our new scheme, and a lot, some of those licence conditions will relate to landlords providing up-to-date documentation, such as appropriate gas safety certificates and so on. And again, we look for the new regime. We're looking at our licensing assistants who will deal with those things as an administrative process, preparing witness statements and so on if landlords don't provide that documentation. So not even actually looking at all officers we have involved in the chain to see what role they could potentially play in terms of enforcement.
Okay.
Would you like to move on to
I'll move on to my
next question?
Yes. my couple of questions. The first is about self-regulation, and it has been touched on, but not necessarily in those terms. But self-regulation can be a very effective way of working, but it's mainly, as we know, for those landlords who are willing to improve. What ideas have you got or do you think it's going to work to enhance it and therefore tackle the landlords who are more resistant to self-regulation? Who would like to take that? Perhaps Dan? Really, it's how can you enhance self-regulation so that actually the more resistant landlords are going to take it up?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch that.
Sorry?
About basically sort of really can self-regulation work for landlords at the lower end of the scale, the ones who have been more resistant to meeting these standards?
We haven't really. We don't think self-regulation is. There's much scope to really transform the way of in standards in the private rental sector. I think generally landlords who choose to join accreditation schemes are generally, they're trying to do the right thing already, but they're in a minority, and I think it's very difficult to reach them, it's something we've not really sort of entertained as a serious idea to develop, and the London rental standard didn't.
Has anyone else got a view on this?
I think we would agree that voluntary initiative just won't deliver the change that is necessary, and that it does need to be supported by, whilst the Mayor would support accreditation, does support accreditation schemes and the benefits of those schemes. I think it's clear to us that we need a strong set of regulation to underpin that.
Sorry, it's clear to you that it's...
It's clear that we need a strong set of regulation to underpin that.
Sure. Okay. So, all right, I got the answer there. Are you satisfied with that, Chair?
I think Meera wants to come in. Sorry, and then Senator Berry, did you have a question?
No.
Oh, sorry, I thought you were putting it out.
No, Meera.
Sorry.
Meera. I think we recognise that self-regulation does. Self-regulation isn't a replacement for basic minimum standards in the sector, and those landlords who don't comply with minimum standards aren't going to comply with the self-regulation scheme. But there is an opportunity, which I think a lot of local authorities miss, to build better relationships with the landlord community. And whether that's through, for example, using the accreditation scheme to offer benefits to landlords such as discounts on licences or improved connections with EHOs to respond to challenges that they're facing, to incentivise landlords to meet that accreditation standard and to give them a benefit beyond just being an accredited landlord. It also means that the local authorities then have a group of landlords who they can engage with and consult with and understand the private rented sector better in that area. And when it comes to introducing other initiatives, having the buy-in of landlords in the local area is really essential for those to be effective and to avoid landlords choosing to leave the market or just having a very difficult relationship with the local authority, which then has knock-on effects in the future. So I think there's something to be said for having both the carrot and the stick approach, and I think that's sometimes missed in these discussions.
David, did you want to comment on this?
I was just going to say that I do think one of the fundamental issues which doesn't help, and I'll probably repeat myself, but again, you know, we don't really have standards as such for private rented accommodation. So I think it's very, you know, it can be quite, maybe it's an excuse, but I think it can be difficult for landlord to look at. You know, there's no published standard that a rental unit needs to meet, and I think that is a difficulty really. As I say, the rating system is the main source of improving conditions in the PRS, and that's not a standard. That's a fairly incomprehensible risk-based assessment process. I mean, what I would say is, I think again through licensing we've got you know, we've got an electronic newsletter. We have over 10,000 landlords on our mailing list. We have regular landlord forums. I'm pleased to say that we have a representative of the NLA who regularly comes along to our landlord forums. We allow, you know, the NLA do sessions where they, the landlords will hear from both ourselves and NLA representatives, and I think that does help. You know, we certainly want to have a collaborative relationship with our responsible landlords. I think one of the frustrating things, I think, is, you know, I've been to several tribunals where we've had civil penalty appeals and so on, and it's mostly around, often things around non-licensing, and we've got landlords who don't have properties in the borough, they don't live in the borough, and what they're saying is, you know, I didn't know anything about licensing at all. And you sort of ask questions about, you know, how do you as a landlord keep abreast of your legal responsibilities? You know, are you a member of a professional body? You know, and most of them just don't have any knowledge at all, or any you know, they don't view themselves as providing you know, as running a business. I think I think that's the overall thing to me. I think a lot of landlords don't think themselves as business people, and they don't feel obliged to keep up to date with, you know, what. You know,
that's interesting.
That's an interesting point.
It's a very interesting point. Does anyone else want to comment on this?
I think related to this, the Mayor would support there being a light touch landlord register, so that you can help make sure landlords comply with their obligations. If you had a landlord register, that would be an easier way to communicate with landlords, to make sure they're kept up to date with their obligations.
Okay, Meera, did you just say you think they should be registered landlords?
I didn't say that, but I think that there's potential for a registration scheme to a light touch registration scheme, which is much lower cost, to be a replacement for some wider scale licensing schemes which aren't actually being enforced.
Light touch, you mean not mandatory?
Not. Rather just being a registration scheme as opposed to a licensing scheme, which is much more expensive. But I think it could be something that could be explored, whether there's scope for a registration scheme to replace licensing in some cases.
I think the Mayor's been clear that he would like the registration to sit alongside licensing, so that the licensing scheme is to look at the property conditions, and you would have landlord registration alongside that.
We're actually going to come on to this issue at the end of the meeting, so if you don't mind, we'll pause until there on that issue.
I just go on then to mandatory registration, because there are many people, and I think most of the panel would share this, that think, and it's also been in various manifestos and so on, that there should be a way of registering landlords in this country. we're the only one of the home countries that doesn't register landlords. Wouldn't it be, it'd be a way of, it's seen, I think, as a way of improving standards and as a way of collecting data on the private sector. So what's stopping us doing that? Who should I ask? Dan?
What's stopping us? I think it would require central government to take the initiative and get started building it, working out. I think there'll be what we'd need to agree is exactly what it takes for someone to be registered as a landlord. Excuse me. What kinds of properties would go on there? I think there's a case for including holiday lets on there, given the rise in certain cities of the holiday let industry, the sharing economy, and making sure that we're keeping track of that alongside the private rental sector. There's a lot of hidden renter households and whether they're HMOs that sort of fly under the radar, and having a single national register with clear standards and criteria.
Is there any reason why?
Sorry,
no, don't let me interrupt you. Sorry.
Just having something at a national level would make it very clear for renters and landlords and the authorities, and make it a much easier sort of sector to manage.
It would give all sorts of protections too to tenants, wouldn't it? Because there'd be some sort of number, there'd be some reference when they went to court and so on about who their landlord is, because very often they're absentee landlords and so on. Is this something London could take up?
If there was a London-only register, that could be it could be somewhere to start. And I know that the Mayor of London has expressed interest in having a London-wide register. Clearly, there would need to be some coordination with Westminster. In case there were efforts, a decision made at the national level to create a database as well, or a register.
So Meera, have you got anything to add? Having said you'd rather have a light touch scheme.
As I said, if the scheme is low cost and to the landlord, we wouldn't want to see landlords having to pay a large fee in order to register as a landlord. But if it's low cost to the landlord, it has the opportunity to be a replacement for some much more expensive licensing schemes. One of the potential proposals that's being discussed in the sector at the moment is whether there's scope for having the equivalent of a so-called property MOT.
Sorry, scope for, can you just speak?
The equivalent of a so-called property MOT, so that there is a regular confirmation of the quality of the property alongside a registration scheme, and that could act as a replacement for licensing. But the detail of that we would have to, look into the detail of exactly what that would look like in order to support such a proposal. But I think there is potential there, and one of the things which we often hear from councils is that licensing is being brought in so that they know who the landlords are. So if that is the case, then a much cheaper registration scheme may be a more proportionate answer.
Make it more?
Proportionate.
Okay. David, do you want to?
Okay, I'm probably a little bit out of touch with the other national schemes, but I thought there was some coverage in Wales and Scotland about queries about the extent to which the registration schemes have been a success and how they were being enforced and what they've actually delivered. So I think that'd probably be one of my queries on that. I think I I can see a place for registration. I'd have really real concerns if people like the NLA advocated it as an alternative to property licence. I think it's fulfilling a completely different purpose, and I don't think it's an alternative to licensing at all in terms of property conditions and so on. I'm the devil with these sort of things always in the detail. I'd also have concerns around things like, what is the definition of a landlord who would need to be registered? So we have significant problems in Waltham Forest with rent-to-rent scams, with ghost tenants, that kind of thing. I'm not sure whether that would really deal with that particular issue, whether those kind of intermediate tenants and head tenants and so on would also be required to be registered as landlords. We always have lots of problems in Waltham Forest with landlords who've got multiple companies, so would each individual company have to be registered as a landlord, and we have lots of issues with companies being closed down, other ones being started up. So I think the devil in some of the detail in terms of how it will actually work as well.
Okay, so Lydia, Scott, there's quite a lot of food for thought and new points there. What do you think? Is that something the Mayor could be either considering or lobbying for?
So in July of this year, the Mayor published his blueprint for reform of private renting in London, and in that he does call for a universal register of landlords. So it's something that he's asked government to devolve him the powers to enable him to do, to require landlords to provide this data. And I think as Lydia has already pointed out, we see very much that registration of landlords would support rather than replace licensing. And so the two, the licensing kind of focuses on property and property conditions, whilst the register of landlord focuses on the individual who is letting out the property. So the two systems we'd see as complementary.
There's no reason why it should be high cost, is there? I mean, it's just got to cover the cost of registering.
So I think certainly the Mayor's position is that any scheme should be light touch, and so costs should be kept at to a minimum level. There's clearly work that needs to be done to collect, to establish what data it is that's going to be collected through that system, in the Mayor's blueprint, one of the kind of, I think that the Mayor's blueprint identifies kind of two possible purposes of that registration scheme. The first is to support a system of rent control, and the second is to help improve conditions in London, property conditions in London. So the data that you collect through a licensing scheme has wider implications than just the standards and conditions of properties. There are a whole range of things that we could seek to collect data on, and I think there's there's thought that needs to be done to narrow that list down.
Thank you. Tom, I think you've covered that.
Just on, in terms of, so at the moment you're not, or your team or the Mayor is not entirely clear on exactly what data you'd want to collect. Do you think it would include things like EPCs, for example? So, if there was some mayoral initiative on energy efficiency, you could target those landlords with the lowest ratings on their property and encourage them to take up some sort of scheme, for example.
So at the moment we haven't got that list, so there definitely would be more work that need to be done on that. Okay,
thank you very much. We'll move on now to Assembly Member Berry.
Thank you. And sticking on the same subject with the GLA team, I think, I want to ask about other ways of improving standards and energy efficiency in particular, but some of the things that within the Decent Home Standard, not using regulation, but using incentives and funding. What is going on with the Mayor's office at the moment on this? Do you have an evaluation of how many private renters, for example, have taken up the Warmer Homes scheme?
So the administration of the Warmer Homes scheme doesn't sit with our team. Let me see if I might have some details in my briefing on this, but we can certainly get that information.
Yeah, I don't think we have. We don't have any figures on the take up of that, so we'd have to get those for you.
Yeah, and certainly the government's new deal, Green Deal, let me get this right. The government's Green Deal scheme was poorly taken up amongst private renters and landlords compared with other tenures. And I think possibly the same thing is likely to be true of the Warmer Homes scheme in London. It's a very similar kind of scheme where both sides need to agree, and it gets more complicated when there's two parties involved. If we can have some information about that, that would be really useful. Sure. One of the recommendations from the Environment Committee's look into cold, damp and mouldy homes was a lot of things were about ventilation, which is something that, again, needs to sort of cross over into our recommendations on the Decent Home Standard. But one of it was that the Mayor should be developing a guide for private renters and landlords to help them be more informed about what schemes are available, like the Green Deal and the Warmer Home Scheme. And obviously that probably would sit within your team. It's the place where people would go rather than some other page about the environment, I think. Has the Mayor contacted you about that in any way yet?
No. No, although we are due to meet with our colleagues in the environment team, so I'm sure that is something that we will be picking up.
And certainly this is one of the benefits of the private rented sector partnership is being able to kind of discuss these issues as well with boroughs across London and discuss how this information is made available to tenants in the local area. You wouldn't therefore know this, but I think we should be asking the Mayor's team what funding they're going to be putting into the Warmer Home Scheme going forwards and what they might do for private renters within that.
Could we get that?
Because that wasn't
get that information from the Mayor's team. Thank you.
Private rented sector specifically wasn't included in the Environment Committee's recommendations.
We will follow up with them about that.
That's great. Can I speak to the National Landlords Association about the similar thing? Because obviously you yourselves feel the need to, and must feel the impending legislation and things coming. You must be lobbying for schemes to help landlords better do this. I think a number of energy efficiency type schemes have more or less failed to engage landlords, possibly the boiler scrappage scheme slightly more because it was simpler, but if you could set out where you're at with these kinds of incentives.
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a trajectory that is not yet entirely clear, but landlords are going to need to improve the energy efficiency of their properties over the coming decades.
Yep, just the climate emergency alone seems to suggest we all should be playing our part in that.
I think what we are pushing for is much more clarity about what that longer term trajectory is, so that landlords can plan better the progress that they need to make over a period of years, and implement that during the key time to make changes to the property is when there is a change in tenancy, if there's a void period. So to enable landlords to make the plans necessary to be able to make those bigger changes. We do want the government to give more support to landlords in order to meet these targets. Things like the landlord energy saving allowance, which allowed landlords to claim some tax relief on energy efficiency improvements were removed, and so we're pushing for those to be reintroduced because currently landlords can't, basically, so it's a higher cost to them, and we would be keen to see the introduction of some kind of possibly a loan scheme or something similar that would enable landlords to make those larger changes if they don't have the capital available and to pay that back over time. We'd be keen to see the government contribute at least a portion of that towards the landlord's costs, or to introduce some favourable interest, for example. So to make that easier for landlords, but we recognise that it is a process over 10 to 20 years that is going to have to be implemented. And the final area that we're pushing on is the introduction of a kind of building passport. So basically an improved version of an EPC that makes clear what the changes are that can be made to the property, that sits with the property and can be passed on to a future owner, and details what changes have been made, what changes could be made in the future, and what that trajectory is to reach an A rating on an EPC. If it is EPC ratings that are going to continue to be the the measure for efficiency. So that would mean that at the moment, currently, when an EPC is assessed, it's based on a visual check. So if you don't know that there's insulation in the property and you can't see it, then it's not going to be included in the rating of the property. So making it much clearer what improvements have been made and how to reach that top rating will enable landlords to plan their businesses better.
Were landlords discouraged from taking part in, say, the Green Deal because it stayed with the property and therefore was something that might prevent them from selling it on or anything like that? I can see for homeowners it was an issue, but also you think with landlords regarding homes as more assets, it might be an even bigger disincentive to get to tie the home into a long-term deal.
I think that, yes, potentially, and also it's whether that change is going to make a difference to the value of the property. So there might be, if you don't see the benefit of it in terms of that change to the value of the property, or maybe a tax incentive for higher rated properties when you come to sell, then there's less incentive to make the changes. And at the time that the Green Deal was introduced, the minimum efficiency standards weren't in place either, so there just wasn't an incentive there for landlords.
I mean, obviously landlords make money, they make profits, rents have gone up above inflation for many years now. A lot of the things you're asking for are essentially for government subsidy, tax breaks and grants and things like that. Is there anything that landlords are doing to try and share the costs between them, or to get maybe collectively to borrow money to do the work that's needed? A lot of the arguments you use are things like, you know, a single landlord with only one property can't possibly afford to do this. But you are a large group of people. You house a lot of Londoners. Potentially you could get together and make this more possible as a group without involving public money.
You mean individual landlords?
Yeah, but collectively working on schemes to reduce the problems within homes and reduce your carbon footprint as well. That could be something you would do without involving public money because you make profits.
I think it's potentially, but I think given the makeup of the landlord community, it'd be very hard to pull together so many different individual landlords who have smaller portfolios, where there's larger groups of larger portfolio landlords who have more scope to sort of spread that risk across their portfolios, then I think that could be something that could be explored. But when it comes to those landlords with much smaller properties, they're hard to reach for anyone. So I'm not sure how realistic that approach would be.
Okay. I mean, you've recently merged with your sister organisation, so you're now a bigger organisation.
Yes.
As well, that gives even more potential.
But between us, we just still have around 80,000 landlords, which in the scope of 2 million landlords is a bit of a drop in the ocean.
Okay. Dan, obviously renters are all individuals as well. Renters are sort of doing more work, teaming up through your organisation and the Renters Union. Are your groups doing anything to develop or lobbying for improvement incentives and grants as opposed to just regulation at the moment?
In relation to energy efficiency?
Well, you know, improvements in general, repairs and that kind of thing.
So there's one of the things that we're doing is taking our research and looking at how we can equip renters in local areas to wherever they are to engage better with their local authority, and if their council isn't performing particularly well on enforcement, then how to hold them to account. There are renters unions around the country, including London Renters Union, that are organising renters at the moment and currently doing a lot of work to support individual renters who have particular problems, whether it's disrepair, whether it's unfair evictions, or being ripped off in some way. And so through that process of member support, they're learning about how best to get the local authority to respond, and indeed whether it's necessary if the renters union can approach landlords directly and negotiate that way. Indeed, I think there's a lot that could be done if renters had a bit more confidence in communicating with landlords. In a lot of cases, there's generally poor communication, poor levels of trust between tenants and landlords, and if we improve that, then that we could see a lot more improvement in the quality of the homes. One of the things that we've been campaigning for and the government is now consulting on is changing Section 21 of the Housing Act 1988, which allows landlords to evict without needing a reason, and that gives some landlords, the scrupulous landlords, the ability to essentially bully tenants into not making complaints. There's this risk, this fear of being on the receiving end of a no-fault eviction, as they're called, gives tenants a sort of it hinders their confidence in asking, in negotiating for repairs. Just on the on energy efficiency, a couple of points on that. I think it's quite tricky for tenants to really engage in that process when typically, or the median tenancy lasts for just over 2 years. For the first year, the tenant doesn't really know what they're going to be spending on their energy bills. The following year, they have some idea, but they're maybe still in they still don't necessarily feel that they're going to be in that home for a long time, and that it's worth asking about making improvements. And I suppose another factor that limits that is if any support is means tested. You might have one private renter whose income would enable their landlord to get support for improvements, but 2 years down the line, it's a different tenant who's who hasn't necessarily asked for the improvements, and there's a lack of incentive essentially for the tenant to make those requests. I think if we had a culture where tenants were felt a bit more stable in their homes, then we might see that improve. And then, I mean, the idea of a building passport which told tenants exactly what's been done to their home and what could be improved could be a way of encouraging those improvements as well.
Yeah, sorry, it's a bit unfair to ask you that. I mean, I know you're at the point of just forming and dealing, sort of firefighting with the problems at the moment, but I think it'd be great if we can get to the point where everyone's talking to each other and actual improvements can be discussed. That would be great. I'm going to move on to the next question, which is about the Homes Fitness for Human Habitation Act, which came into force this March, I think. Dan, can you explain what the new provisions are to us? I suspect you possibly know. And also, how do you see it having an impact?
So, since any tenancies that's been signed since March, the tenant can, if their landlord is failing to repair something that's unsafe, they can essentially take their landlord to court rather than necessarily going through the local council route. There is, I think from my understanding of the guidance, it makes sense for the tenant to pursue both routes anyway, because the local council could provide support if they decide to proceed with a case against the landlord. There's a number of steps where the tenant has to inform the landlord they're taking action, and there's opportunities for the landlord to remedy the disrepair before it actually gets to the point where they're in court, and there's if it does get to that point, the court can award compensation to the tenant for having lived in an unfit home.
How does it relate to the retaliatory evictions rules? Because we were discussing the council enforcement earlier on, and there needs to be a enforcement notice. Is that right? Anyway, yeah. If you've just notified your landlord that you wish to use the Act, does that protect it?
I don't believe there is any protection at the moment, unless the council has also served an improvement notice.
So that's why you're are you advising people to use both routes?
Yeah. So that's it makes most sense because the council could leap into action and deliver the result that the tenant's after. It's really hard as a tenant to know what to expect from your council. Sometimes when we've asked tenants about it, sometimes the council's been good, sometimes the council's just felt like they've done the bare minimum. Sometimes it's very rare that they don't do anything at all. But yeah, there's definitely sort of the effectiveness of the council's activities in response to a complaint varies quite a lot.
If the council isn't doing their job, or if the tenant just chooses the court route, they can take their landlord to court. That requires legal advice. So is that something that tenants are able to get pro bono? Is there a way of solicitors getting back the money at the end of things, or is this a cost to tenants and is it putting people off?
We haven't really seen much response from the legal sector so far. There have been contingent fee arrangements operating in parts of the sector where, for example, your tenancy deposit hasn't been protected. You can get sort of free advice up front, and then if you get compensation, the law firm would take a cut of that. So I think there has been interest in providing those services, so we haven't really seen much so far. It's been quite I think it's only been 6 months that's been in place. There's legal aid potentially for some tenants affected by this, and then there has been sort of the suggestion that tenants could have legal insurance, which would step in, but I think that's fairly untested at the moment.
You do have, generally, when you buy home contents insurance, you have legal insurance, but I'm guessing that wouldn't cover this. It's for claiming back if something's gone horribly wrong. We've had different sort of messages from the insurance sector on that, and in a lot of cases, tenants don't even have contents insurance in the first place, and it's normally an add-on, an optional add-on, so they wouldn't necessarily, unless it was explicit saying this legal insurance is really handy if your landlord's rubbish. This is why you should add it onto your policy, unless that's explicit. I don't know if insurance providers. This is a new thing, and I'm sure there are gaps in the market for making it more effective. Do you have any statistics yet about how much it's being used?
How much the new Act?
Yes, I'll ask the other members of the panel this as well.
No.
Do any of the other panel members have any? David in Waltham Forest, are you aware of any residents using both tracks at the same time?
I think it's very new. I mean, I think it's completely untried and tested as a legal concept yet. So I think it's very in the early stages, really. I think again, it's not the whole concept of what is unfit under this Act has not really been tested out in the court. So it's actually quite vague in terms of hazards. It's not defined definitively in terms of if there is a category 1 hazard present, it will be unfit. It's not as simple as that. So there could be Cat 1 hazards and the property is still not unfit. There could be Cat 2 hazards and it could be considered to be unfit by whoever hears it. So I think it's very early days yet and quite untried and tested at the moment.
Meera, do you have any comment to make on any impacts you've noticed so far, even though it's early days?
We haven't seen any significant impact so far, but this was a piece of legislation which we supported. I think it is very early days, and as Dan mentioned, tenants do have the option to go to their local council if they want to make a complaint, and I think that the lower proportion of tenants who maybe are aware that they have this act available to them might also be an issue in terms of tenants knowing what avenues they have.
Thank you very much. We're now going to move on to mayoral initiatives, both previous and current mayors, and Assemblymember Cooper is going to start us off on that section.
Yes, I'm going to ask you about the previous mayor, some bloke. I don't think anyone knows much about what he's doing these days. He introduced the London rental standard, which was then scrapped by the current mayor. And I just wondered, we haven't been able to uncover in our research for today's meeting whether or not there had been any kind of sort of full evaluation, because it ran from when it was introduced in 2014 and until obviously it was scrapped by the current mayor. So I'm going to start with Scott and Lydia, and just to say, you know, was any evaluation done? Is it something we just haven't been able to find? Was it any good having a sort of voluntary standard? Because I think that was one of the main criticisms, was that might be what Meera would like, you know, something that people had to choose whether or not they signed up to. And did it have any impact at all?
So I think I don't have the specific figures here, but it certainly
Would you be able to send those afterwards, though, perhaps?
we can look into that. I think effectively it didn't meet its targets in terms of getting the numbers of landlords signed up. It was a voluntary scheme.
Yes, I think 100,000 was aimed for, and
yes,
only 15,000 registered, so that's
yes,
quite significant
yes,
gap there.
Yeah, so yeah, it simply didn't have the impact that it aimed to have.
And I think as we've, as per our kind of previous discussion, I think whilst the mayor has kind of set out that he does support the benefits of accreditation scheme, actually on its own it's not sufficient, and that there does need to be a stronger system of regulation that sits behind that.
Yes, I mean, I think it's a sort of, I mean, this is where I do agree with Meera and with David. I think the sort of the carrot and stick approach, and having something that's light touch. My personal preference is when you relet a property that you have a sort of, you know, I think at one point it was being called a logbook, so that you can sort of see that the property is up to scratch and so on and so forth, and that seems very light touch. You just have to have, you know, you can't buy a car and then run it on the road unless it complies with certain pretty, you know, necessary standards. And to me, you know, the point when a property goes from one tenant to another is the obvious point at which, very light touch, you've got to do all the paperwork like a new tenancy agreement. You've got to sort out the deposit, just sort out all the, you know, all the stuff to do with making sure it's in decent condition. But I mean, it doesn't sound as though the previous London rental standard really had any impact on, you know, raising, you know, and there are some, it's a small number of properties, a small number of landlords, but, you know, quite a hardcore of not very, you know, just not in very good condition. And it did it touch that at all? Any signs of that?
I don't think it did touch on those substandard and non-compliant landlords. It was the compliant landlords who tended to voluntarily register for the scheme.
So would you say then that it was the landlords who were already, you know, the better landlords, if you like, or renting out the better properties, if it's more to do with the properties really rather than the landlords themselves, who were the ones who registered?
Yes, generally,
right.
yes. Yes.
And do you think there's an advantage to having a single accreditation scheme? Obviously, individual local authorities can have their own local arrangements, but obviously this was a London rental standard. Do you think that works better than having 32 separate schemes? Should there even be a national scheme?
Well, I think the advantage of having a single scheme is that you would have consistency. But as I say, I mean, if we're still talking about voluntary schemes, I just don't think they have enough effect, they're just not going to have that impact on raising standards anyway.
So a voluntary scheme, whether it's a national scheme, a London-wide scheme, or even a borough scheme, is not as good as having something that people are obliged to sign up to, if you
I think on its own, it's not going to have the impact, and that's why the Mayor has called for, he supports property licensing and a landlord registration scheme, because that's the way that you could really improve standards across the sector.
Well, I'm only asking you about the previous mayor, that bloke, his previous scheme that is no longer existing. But I think we are going to move on to the current mayor and what he's up to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assemblymember Cooper. Yes. So moving on to the current mayor, the question is, what is the impact of the mayor's initiatives such as the Road Landlord Checker and the Private Rented Sector Partnership on London's boroughs, landlords and tenants? So I'll start with David with the boroughs. Have you got an assessment of what the impact has been so far of these mayoral policies?
I think it's been very useful to have the GLA providing a forum for all the boroughs to get together and to share good practice and to support and encourage each other to do more with what's available. And I think, as already been alluded to, we're doing a short presentation in a week's time around interim management. It's a really good forum to try and encourage other people to use the legislation to its fullest. Really, I think certainly the rogue agent and landlord checker, it's something that we will routinely look at when we're dealing with properties to see whether the person we're dealing with is also causing problems in other areas, really. So in general terms, the work is very useful in terms of supporting a more consistent and robust approach, I think.
Okay, thank you. Meera, from the landlord's perspective.
I think from the landlord's perspective, for the vast majority of landlords, those schemes haven't really made that much difference because they're not going to be on the rogue landlord database. And there isn't really that much more kind of proactive engagement with London landlords to sort of engage with them as a community. We obviously have a relationship with the GLA, which is very important, and we have conversations with them, but I think the wider sort of mayoral initiatives to engage with landlords are missing.
Are you involved in the Private Rented Sector Partnership, or is that not something?
No, we're not.
Okay. Do you think you should be?
I think it would be useful to have that kind of opportunity for engagement, yeah.
Okay, thank you. And Dan, from the tenant's perspective?
I think there's about 400 odd landlords and letting agents, in fact probably 400 odd offences that are currently listed on the database, so it's quite a small, obviously a small proportion of the city's rental sector. So it's hard to really gauge, how useful it would be to an average tenant who's looking for a home. I think it would be it is useful from the perspective of renters organisations like ourselves and London Renters Union to see is a landlord who has been flagged up by one tenant, have they got into trouble with a council already. It's also really useful to just see what types of what tenants can expect really from councils to some extent, and the breakdown that's available on the website is really useful for that.
Okay, thank you. And coming to Scott and Lydia, do you want to comment on any of this? And I'm particularly keen if you've got any sort of performance metrics that you can give us, for example, particularly in terms of the rogue landlord and agent checker.
Yeah, so I think, Daniel, right, there's about 400 records on the public tier at the moment, but there's over 1,800 records on the private tier of the checker, which is what local authorities are able to access, so they can check to see if landlords and agents they're looking into have already been prosecuted. And
perhaps just to add in on that as of yesterday, 118,000 users, so London renters, have accessed or have looked at
118,000
records on the checker. So I think that demonstrates the impact that has had for renters in London.
And there's also been about 1,300 reports.
90,000 of those views were you and Sean, I think.
Exactly.
So we're not counting
it's generation
City
rent,
Hall
yeah.
IP addresses.
Sorry, Lydia, what were you
We're
saying?
not counting City Hall users.
Right,
We do
okay.
take them out.
Are you counting council? Are you checking outside of like gov.uk IP addresses to see which are actual members of the public and which are public authorities?
No, we can check whether. I don't think they are filtered out. The City Hall IP addresses are definitely taken out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Your question, sorry, that you
It
were
was
waving.
how do you know these are, and these are individual IP addresses, not
Yes.
Yeah,
And
sorry,
then also
continue.
was just an add, we've had about 1,300 reports submitted by tenants or prospective tenants through our Reporter Rogue tool as well. And those reports go straight through to the enforcement teams at the councils to follow up on.
Fantastic. That's very good to hear. And one thing I forgot to ask Dan, actually, are you involved in the private rented sector partnership with Generation Rent? Is it just a borough initiative?
In terms of actual membership, it's the leads from the borough enforcement teams.
Right.
However, we do have lots of external organisations coming in periodically to the meetings to talk to the boroughs and to raise awareness of issues.
Okay. David?
Can I just say as well, I think the GLA have tried to really move the agenda on, beyond governments. The governments obviously had their national rogue landlord database, but I think the GLA certainly in making a decision quite early to publish civil penalties as in addition to prosecution has been a really positive thing. So I think a lot of boroughs have moved away from prosecuting to civil penalties, and if not having those formal actions made public would definitely act to the detriment of private tenants out there, really.
Great. Yes, Scott.
Sorry, I think the only thing I'd add on there, which is a slight tangent, but it's really kind of important to raise here, which is that the partnership has kind of really, for the purposes of the team, it's helped to really help us to understand the issues that are being faced by councils and by renters in London, and that some of the learning from that has helped to underpin the Mayor's blueprint for reforming private renting in London, which I mentioned earlier on, and which, as I set out, kind of calls for rent controls in London, but also calls for reforms of tenancy security. So I think the learning we've got from that partnership has helped across the board with the work in the private rented sector team.
Thank you. Okay, well, the last question on our list we sort of decided has actually been answered earlier in the meeting, really. So we're going, unless members have got any other questions. Andrew.
Just one very brief one. We often want to know the performance of local authorities in how they are carrying out their responsibilities. Do you think that local authorities' response times to complaints by private tenants about their landlords should be published? Anyone?
Sorry?
Do you think the response times for local authorities,
The response time?
the response times to problems that are pointed out to them by tenants, do you think that they should be published?
I think a lot of things should be published by the councils as part of our statistics. We did FOI requests to councils. We didn't actually ask for response times. One of the things we have looked at when we've been looking at their websites is how they're managing tenants' expectations. So I think that's quite important. There's a lot of variation in what councils actually report and record. So there's a lot of councils that actually record how many hazards they found. So that's something we would...
So do you think, therefore, on that basis, that there should be a time limit for local authorities to respond to property complaints?
What sort of time limit?
Well, such as 1 working day for urgent complaints, health and safety complaints, and perhaps 2 working days for non-urgent complaints for them to respond.
I think a standard for councils would be useful on that, and having just being clear to the tenant how what they can expect. Obviously if it's a danger to health, then it should be, you know, as soon as possible. Obviously that's...
The reason I asked this question is former Assembly member Kemi Badnock. She published a report and in the process found a huge variation across London boroughs of their responsiveness to tenants' complaints. So it's been quite useful for you to say that, put that on the record. Thank you very much. Anybody else want to comment on that?
I think it's slightly difficult, but I think all boroughs will have their service standards. But you know, one of the fundamental, you know, what is a response, for example. So, for example, if we get a complaint of disrepair in, you know, our normal response, unless it's something is particularly urgent, it would be some sort of triage letter to the landlord saying, you know, we've had this complaint in, particularly under the, you know, with the extra sanctions available through licensing, you know, this is the complaint. You need to investigate this within 28 days and come back with your findings and how you're going to deal with it. But that's still a quick response, but it's not necessarily a response of going around and visiting the property. So,
thank you very much.
Okay. I don't see any other members, so in that case, can I thank our guests very much for all of your contributions. We have a few more formal items on the agenda that we need to discuss, which you're welcome to stay for, but equally we won't be offended if you decide to leave now. In fact, I'd recommend it.
Oh, is that us as well?
No, sadly you have to stay here for a little bit longer, said Member Cooper. Finally, can I ask the committee to note the report and the discussion and agree to delegate authority to me as chair in consultation with party group lead members to agree any outputs from the discussion?
Agreed.
Thank you. Can I ask the committee to note the Housing Committee work programme?
Noted.
Thank you. The next meeting of the committee is scheduled for the 3rd of October 2019 at 2 o'clock here in the Chamber, City Hall. There is no other urgent business, so I close the meeting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.